Hello, everyone. Um, Welcome to the 4Nature webinar. My name is David Meyers. I'm the Executive Director of the Conservation Finance Alliance, and together with the Conservation Strategy Fund, we're thrilled to have this webinar with you all here. And we have so much to cover that I'm going to jump right in with a couple of introductory slides here. Just to let you know, we started this webinar series. This is the second one that we've had, and we're looking forward to having a series of webinars going forward. The next one will be in September, so um, please pay attention. If you would like to sign up for a newsletter to hear about the upcoming webinars and podcast episodes, please scan that QR code. That'll take you to the website, and you can then sign up for a newsletter there. So, and we our last podcast was with Sinclair Vincent, who is one of our esteemed panelists today. So if you haven't seen or listened to, or if you haven't listened to the podcast yet, please do so. And very much looking forward to the next in a series. We'll have the next podcast will be on Mozambique's biofund, and more coming up. So again, please sign up for those podcasts, and you can keep track. So today we're going to talk about biodiversity credits, challenges, and opportunities. We have a great panel here, and really looking forward to getting into that panel. And I just wanted to kind of just give a 2-minute introduction to biodiversity credits or nature credits. And as many of you who are on this call will know, these are an innovative, relatively new concept. So much is still being developed. There are a range of methodologies and standards being developed. There are a range of organizations, and we'll hear from some of those organizations today who are leading the way to try to establish some integrity, to establish clarity in the market, to define what they are, and to see how we can really use this new mechanism to move more finance, and especially private finance, to biodiversity conservation with some concrete outcomes. So as we go through the different panelists, everyone will do an introduction. If you do have questions, please put them into the Q&A part of the webinar here, and we'll hopefully have some time at the end to go through some of those questions. We'll try to answer them as well as we go. And yeah, just looking forward to hearing from the panelists. And we'll start the session with Tim Mayle, who is the Executive Director of the Environmental Policy Innovation Center, and has been involved in biodiversity credits for a bit. We're going to then hear from Sinclair Vincent, who's a Senior Director at Verra, Grégoire De Warren, Deputy Director at the International Advisory Panel on Biodiversity Credits, Toral Shah, who's Biodiversity Coordinator at Plan Vivo, one of the early movers in the space. And I will do a little introduction about what we're working on at the CFA as well, before we get into a lively discussion from the panel. So everyone's going to do a little introduction. Timothy, we'll start with you, and passing it over to you.
Great. Thanks, David. And hello and good morning to everybody. I'm really happy to be here. I'm the executive director of an organization called the Environmental Policy Innovation Center, as David said. And what we care about is faster environmental and public health progress. And so we view biodiversity credits as a route toward faster progress, is the simplest way to say it. And we're involved in a number of kind of policy setting, direction setting efforts around the world, including the Biodiversity Credit Alliance, and also in trying to develop some forest-based biodiversity projects here in the United States. Not develop ourselves, I should say, but really serve as an advisor to projects. Give me 1 second while I share my slides. Great, there we go. And thumbs up, you can see that, David, all looks good, great. So I mentioned the Biodiversity Credit Alliance, which is one of the international efforts to make progress in this space. And I work with BCA and a set of members and partner organizations to come up with a definition. There's kind of a number of options around, what is a biodiversity credit, but here's the definition that the BCA came up with from a consensus point of view, which is a certificate measured and evidence-based unit of positive biodiversity outcome that's durable and additional. And way too little time to get into all the details of all the terms in green shown there, but it's a workable definition. It's not honestly that different from definitions of nature units or ecosystem units that you'd see in many other contexts. Part of what I wanted to do is just describe a little bit of the way we see things. And I have an American accent. And so have a lot of past history working on US programs. And this is kind of the world of nature credits in the United States to date. And these are all regulatory credits. So they're not voluntary biodiversity credits, they're regulatory credits. But it's a few $1 billion a year that go into stream offsets, wetland offsets, water quality credits, and Endangered Species Act driven credits. That's a pretty significant market of both company and government actors that are held responsible for addressing their footprint and by spending it on other projects that benefit nature. When I think about voluntary, and I use the word voluntary in a very loose and still undefined way, as far as I can tell, biodiversity credit demand, to me, really where it's coming from is footprint, compensatory action to deal with a footprint, a supply chain, also often very loose and nebulous impacts like the operation of any single farm in any country on downstream biodiversity if there's water involved. That's an example of a very diffuse and difficult to define impact or footprint on nature, which are almost exclusively not regulated anywhere in the world, including in developed countries like the US, but are increasingly subject to disclosure-related regulations, financial regulations, as opposed to environmental regulations. And those disclosure regulations have a lot of potential to drive demand, maybe over 3 to 10 years for biodiversity credits to deal with biodiversity impacts that cannot be avoided. We see there's lots of positive direction on purely voluntary contributions to biodiversity. We just don't see that pot of money growing that much beyond where it is today. So let's say it doubles. Let's say effectively philanthropic voluntary contributions double. Biodiversity credits are a useful way to direct those resources, but we just don't see it growing as dramatically as footprint or supply chain focused demand. And what we're trying to do is bring a set of principles that come from a lot of hard learned lessons in the United States and some other countries into this discussion about biodiversity credits. So principles like there need to be guarantees around environmental outcomes, around biodiversity outcomes. Either you have insurance or bonding, or you have, you have evidence that the project has already worked, right? You don't sell credits until there's biodiversity gain or uplift that's been measured, that's been third-party verified. So these are a set of principles that are, to us really important when it comes to not necessarily in year one of the world of biodiversity credits, but later on as demand materializes, as institutions and organizations mature, we see these kinds of principles being really, really important. Things like, enforcement policies, absence of government subsidy if it's corporate demand, corporate buyers that are driving it. Just some real standards in terms of claims that can be made around biodiversity credits. So, our work is kind of taking some of the US experience and trying to translate that in a way that's useful in global efforts to define, what are biodiversity credits in day one? What are biodiversity credit markets in day one? And then where do they go over the next 3 to 5 to 10 years? And I'll stop there, David.
Well, thanks, Tim. Great overview of a definition and some of the work that you're doing and posing great questions of what's driving demand. Sinclair, we're going to head over to you and hear a little bit about what Verra's been doing.
Sure. Thanks, David, and thanks for having me with the other panelists. So I'm Sinclair Vincent, the Senior Director of Sustainable Development, Program Development and Innovation at Verra. Verra is a standard-setting body, and our flagship program or standard is our voluntary greenhouse gas program known as the VCS standard. But we've also developed or operate 3 other standards, some of which help carbon projects or other types of environmental or development projects to quantify their benefits beyond emission reductions and removals. And so one of those programs is called the Sustainable Development Verified Impact Standard. And that program in itself allows projects of any type to quantify its benefits towards sustainable development and align those outcomes with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And the reason I'm on this panel today is because I'm leading the development of what we call the Nature Framework, which is a methodology that's being developed under our SD Vista program. So this nature framework is specifically designed to scale investment in nature conservation and restoration by certifying what we call nature credits, but similar to what Tim was talking about for biodiversity credits in sort of a voluntary context. So what we're really hoping to do is bring some standardization to the way that biodiversity benefits are quantified and then certified so that companies or others can invest in those outcomes and help achieve nature conservation and restoration goals. So maybe just to talk a little bit about sort of the value of standards and why you might hear a lot about standards and methodologies in this conversation today, and you've probably seen a lot of different ones sort of cropping up in this space. But the idea of bringing standards or standardization to this is first and foremost to help project developers, so folks that are trying to implement some sort of conservation or restoration activity on the ground, to actually help them with the design and implementation of their projects, looking at good practices and things like social and environmental safeguards, other key components of the success factor in implementation of those projects. So actually providing some of those guidelines. Standardization also, of course, brings consistency in the way that projects of similar types are designed, and that allows for some comparability across projects where that is useful. But I think it's important to note that in the standards development process, you also want to, and especially in the biodiversity or nature context, allow for some flexibility, because we know that nature and biodiversity is different in every location. Even if you're working in the same ecosystem type, there's going to be a lot of differences in one land area compared to another. So trying to really strike that balance between flexibility and standardization to help bring a little bit of comparability to the space, but also some credibility in the way that these projects are quantifying their positive outcomes. I think another component that we really like to think about in our standards design process is this sort of element of continual improvement and actually helping projects improve over time, or assess and address issues that make to the land area or whatever the situation may be, but to allow for continual improvement in a standards process. And then a couple other points to just highlight on components that come with a standard that I think are really essential, especially in such a new market, are things like independent third-party audits, a really important component of the certification cycle to ensure that projects are actually following the standard or methodology and its core criteria, that stakeholders have been consulted and are participating effectively in the process. And then another key component is a registry system, which most standards bodies would have or link to actually provide a place to issue those credits and ensure that there are no kind of double counting or double issuance of credits, and that they can actually be retired when a company is making a claim about the purchase of a credit. So just a couple of really important components of standards programs that may be cropping up in this space, and I'm sure we'll dig into some of those details throughout the conversation. So that'll pass over back to David.
Thank you, Sinclair. Yeah, we're and this is like a speed round here where we're rapidly covering sort of a lot of interesting topics, and hopefully we'll get to dive deeper into some of them. Grégoire, over to you to share with us a bit about the International Advisory Panel on Biodiversity Credits and the work that you're doing.
Thank you very much, David. Yeah, so short introduction myself. So I'm Grégoire De Warren. I'm seconded by the French Treasury. As I'm the deputy head of the Secretariat of IIPB. So what is IIPB? IIPB is like the International Advisory Panel on Biodiversity Credits. This is an initiative which was launched in June 2023, so 1 year ago. By UK and France. So it's an independent initiative to support the development of high integrity biodiversity credit markets, of course. It's a panel of something like 25 experts from finance, business, NGOs, IPs, and LCs from a dozen of countries. And supported with like a secretariat, so the IPB secretariat, sponsored by two governments, so by France and UK, but it's an independent and global panel. Our work is focused on five major issues we can think with when we think to biodiversity credit markets. So measurement, demand, supply, stewardship, governance. So we work since 1 year now. We try to develop many consultations to have a bottom-up approach. We launched the first consultation in December last year, December 2023, on the global key features of the market, so on the regulation, on the role of IPs and LCs, on some methodological aspect. Then we launched the second consultation in March, April, on the different use cases of biodiversity credits to well understand the difference between the different use cases between, of course, biodiversity credit and compensation. When it's your your own value chain or it's beyond the value chain of the company, to understand all these difference and to be able to have like proper recommendations for these different use cases. What we want to achieve is to go at the CBD COP16, so at Cali, and to be able to announce three things. So to have like a framework, a global framework. Maybe I will speak about that a little bit later, but this framework will be composed of high-level principles and some more technical and technical guidelines, but maybe I will speak about that later. We also want to announce pilots, so pilots to demonstrate, of course, the utility of the framework and to demonstrate and to show, to highlight what is currently the market, the utility of the principles and the guidelines on the ground. And last thing, we want to have like the support of a strong coalition, which is ready to endorse the framework we can be able to propose. Maybe that's okay for a short introduction. Back to you, David, and maybe I will speak later about work on the high-level principles.
Great, thank you, Grégoire. Good overview, and yeah, I think I want to just maybe just frame before we get to Toral that there are multiple groups out there working on different aspects, and just a shout out to the Biodiversity Credit Alliance, which is really pulled together a lot. Tim mentioned them in the beginning. They pulled together a lot. The World Economic Forum has also taken a leadership role in the early stages here. So quite a number of groups out there, and the IAPB is definitely working to kind of support and work with all of them. Everyone seems to be collaborating quite well. Toral, over to you as a intro to Plan Vivo and the work that you've been doing. You've been a leader in the space, so let's hear what you've been up to.
David, and again, thank you for inviting me onto this panel. Really glad to be here. So as you mentioned, my name is Toral. I'm the biodiversity coordinator at Plan Vivo. I've been here for about 2 years, sorry. And my background is a biologist, particularly in plant science and evolutionary biology, with a strong focus in East Africa. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Plan Vivo, we are a charitable foundation and also a certification body, really working to support communities, smallholder groups, and indigenous peoples access different nature markets, so that we can empower them and mobilize the access to different resources. So over the last 25 years, we've been stewarding a voluntary carbon certification, really focusing on putting communities at the center of the kind of project design, and also ensuring that they equitably benefit from the sale of any traded certificates. And based on this experience, over the last 2 years or so, we've been trying to expand our reach and our impact. So really building on the Plan Vivo model and the values and experiences we've learned with a lot of community-based and community-led projects, but also through increased recognition of the scale of biodiversity loss across the globe and its impact. So really trying to make a change here and access more communities and reach more ecosystems. So building on and learning from lessons of the existing voluntary carbon market, we see a huge opportunity here to shape the future of biodiversity credits with high integrity, based on credible claims and real high quality projects. So that's a little bit about me and Plan Vivo, and I'll just share my screen now. Hopefully this works. So hopefully you can see my screen. Just give me a thumbs up. Sounds good. And so thinking about what we've been doing for the last 2 years, we've been developing a new biodiversity standard. It's called PV-Nature. And this schematic here is really to illustrate the complexities and the different pieces of the puzzle that go into developing and thinking about what makes a biodiversity standard. So I'm going to start at the core of this image here, and that's PV-Nature as a standard. So that involves all the core documentation and the rigorous certification process. A lot of what Sinclair was mentioning already around the well-known tried and tested approach and method to which we onboard projects and we verify and validate those outcomes. But then we really feel that's supported by the foundation as a whole, so our core values and our principles, but also the experience of working with community-based projects for the last 20 odd years. And then supported by the pillars of transparency and resilience. So on the transparency side, of course, it's around transparency in monitoring and reporting of the outcomes and the results, but also around the accountability in how the certificates are traded and the claims that are associated to that. And then we're always thinking about resilience. So how do we build resilience into the project approach from the very beginning? And we strongly believe around incorporating regional alignment within the projects and within how the projects are designed. Building capacity, and that ties into some of the principles around durability or permanence and long-term change. And then kind of building on the theory of change, sharing knowledge, building capacity, and ensuring things are looked at on a longer-term basis. And all of our projects have a very holistic lens. So when we start thinking about outcomes and the impact, it's not just for biodiversity, but of course, people and climate as well. And when I talk about people, I really talk about how to engage people from a participatory perspective. So how our projects engaging communities, local stakeholders, not just from a decision-making process, which is of course very important, but from a governance process as well. Including comprehensive stakeholder engagement and participatory workshops, but also including Indigenous knowledge in how we measure and monitor biodiversity and the indicators that we need to look out for, ensuring there's appropriate grievance mechanisms and safeguardings, both for social perspectives and environmental perspectives. And then, as I mentioned, looking at the equitable benefit sharing mechanisms that may be designed and ensuring that they are truly rewarding and incentivizing Indigenous peoples and local communities. When it comes to monitoring biodiversity, we're thinking about how do we engage the community, not just in the monitoring and the results, but actually in the activities of doing the monitoring. And with that said, making this really accessible and practicable, but also ensuring that it's based on rigorous science, that we know that we're using metrics and measurements that are well studied, that are peer reviewed, and that really will align to those global goals for nature recovery. As I mentioned, we want to be able to create impact at a landscape level. So allowing an approach that can be scaled up and remain feasible, and then generate results that are evidence-based so that we can compare and repeat this over time and communicate that at a market level so we understand what is actually changing on the ground. And through that evidence-based approach, you then create a way to have auditable data so that we can track that change. And of course, allowing space for iteration and innovation. It's a very fast-moving space. It's a very technology is driving lots of innovative developments. So allowing space for iteration and innovation as we learn and grow with learnings from our projects on the ground. And then, of course, thinking about climate. So tracking of environmental conditions, which of course can link very much to how businesses and companies also track their dependencies, and recognition of existing carbon pools and sources. And as I mentioned, environmental safeguarding. So that really ties into the whole piece of resilience, particularly and hopefully against climate change as well. And what else have we been doing over the last 2 years? Well, we've been working with some amazing projects, really trying to understand the variation in habitat types, ecosystems, how the methodology will apply in all of these various contexts. But most importantly, really trying to understand the variation in the social dynamics. So what are the land tenure situations, or how is the local community engaged already, and what does that look like going forward? So we have been really learning from a lot of these pilot or launch projects. We have been operating now as a launch standard for over 6 months now. We launched in December 2023. And we are working with both terrestrial and marine projects to really iron out some of the complexities in monitoring biodiversity across such complex environments. So I'll stop there and I'll hand it back to you, David.
Thank you, Toral. What a great overview of what you've been doing, and it sort of outlined in a way the process and all the details that need to go into a standard and to the monitoring and the considerations that we need to focus on. I'm going to just sort of present a little bit about what the Conservation Finance Alliance has been working on. We do have a task force on nature credits. We've been also working with Verra on the nature development framework, nature framework development, and we are also working with the IAPB to move some of these ideas forward. So, but one of the things I wanted to share is that we've been working on developing an idea for a nature or biodiversity stewardship certificate. And the reason that we are working on this, in addition to a lot of the work that's already going on, is that a lot of the initiatives are learning from what's been going on in the carbon market, especially the voluntary carbon market. And historically, areas that have been well managed, forests that have been well managed, high forest, low deforestation countries have been excluded from the carbon markets. And so we wanted to make sure in the biodiversity markets that was not the case. So we've been developing this concept, and I'm just going to kind of show you a little bit how it fits into the range of other approaches here. So most of there's a lot of methodologies being developed right now, and most of them are focused on either uplift or maintenance. So you start with the counterfactual. Here's what biodiversity is looking like over time. It is decreasing, and throughout almost all areas of the world, biodiversity, of course, is under massive threat. And so one option might be to maintain biodiversity in light of that projected loss, what's called the counterfactual. So you have to project what the situation is. The change in biodiversity condition measured through kind of multi-variable index is what you could generate as a maintenance credit. So that's one approach. Perhaps you're actually going to restore, which is the green line here. Now that could be over a flat counterfactual, or it could be over a declining counterfactual, and that would be an uplift credit. And these two approaches assume that we can project pretty well into the future what this counterfactual would be, but also recognize, if you're going to assign the number of credits based on this change over the counterfactual, then areas that are actually starting off in really good shape, at a score of 0.9 or 90% of their intactness, for example, and are maintained, are pretty much excluded from the market. So we're trying to create this nature stewardship credit or certificate that will give credit to those who have high levels of biodiversity and are maintaining that. So then it brings into question is how do you prove additionality, which I'm sure we'll get into a little bit as we discuss. But I just wanted to share with you this work that we're doing. This is an ongoing process, and we're very open to input and feedback on how to develop this and how to maintain the levels of integrity that everyone is trying to achieve with these credits. So, and I guess one other point I'd like to make is and maybe we'll use this to start our discussion, is that as Tim mentioned a bit, citing the regulatory markets in the U.S. as a kind of driver for investment in habitat banks and wetland banking. Right now, we're pretty much only talking about a voluntary carbon market, although there are some countries that are thinking about regulatory markets. The goal here, I guess, is to drive new money into conservation, and this is only one of the mechanisms to do that. But maybe I'm going to go to Tim to start with and just say, how do you see the relationship between voluntary and regulatory markets in terms of biodiversity credits, and where do you see are the opportunities for scale and really getting money flowing into nature here?
Yeah, I mean, if imagine that just $20 million per year was going into voluntary biodiversity credits globally, that's $3 billion, right? So 1%, 0.5% of the global nature investment deficit. Imagine that grows to $30 billion a year, so $200 million per country, excuse me. That's still a really small amount of investment in all but the smallest, geographically smallest countries for conservation. So for me, the key first questions about voluntary biodiversity credits are how do you pay for the most obvious beneficial projects for nature, projects that The Guardian and Bloomberg are not going to easily pick apart, because it's not about getting money everywhere to everyone, because there just isn't going to be that level of demand in the first few years. I mean, it's just not going to happen, right? No markets, very few markets, AI being an exception, start that way. So if you're talking about a small number of projects, how do you cite those projects in a good way? And to get to your question about regulatory, because biodiversity is not fungible, you can't harm a flying squirrel in one place and offset it with a fish somewhere else, or do a balancing project somewhere else, right? Like those things aren't ultimately in the long scheme of things. That's not going to work out. Countries are going to want to see ebb and flow, right, of activity in their own boundaries. So it naturally sets up a situation for some engagement at a regulatory level. That could be financial regulatory or environmental regulatory. But to me, the first projects could also help all those countries figure out, what they want to do and how they want to approach it. There's lessons on every continent from regulatory offset programs already. So there's plenty of at least regional examples to learn from.
So in a way, the voluntary market is an opportunity for us to experiment and see what works. I would say 5 years ago, very few people were thinking about biodiversity. 1 ton of carbon equivalent is 1 ton of carbon equivalent. Biodiversity is so hard to quantify. Maybe over to you, Sinclair, in terms of how do we use standards to come up with something that is understandable in a way to a buyer, to a market, to potential investors, and even to governments. And how are we, how can this move the conversation forward?
Yeah, I think it's tricky. I think coming back to what I was saying earlier about striking that balance between flexibility and standardization so that there can be some sense of comparability across the market, even though we know that the different programs, standards, methodologies out there are going to have slightly different definitions for their units. And that's okay, because we need finance to be channeled into these projects no matter what. And so I think I'd want to highlight the sort of approach of simplicity as much as possible, to going to your point of, we need people to be able to understand this, whether it's from a government perspective, the project developer perspective, and especially the buyer perspective that really does have the dollars to be able to invest in these outcomes. It needs to be simply understood and able to kind of dock into what companies especially are trying to achieve within their supply chain, beyond their supply chain, within and outside the mitigation hierarchy. And maybe just to kind of piggyback on your question to Tim, I absolutely agree with what Tim shared there. And I just want to highlight a couple of other opportunities for biodiversity credits, what they can bring to sort of the broader financial landscape for biodiversity conservation and restoration. And that's just increasing the awareness of the potential and actual biodiversity outcomes that can come out of projects like these, whether they're carbon projects or not carbon projects. I think oftentimes the biodiversity benefits of these projects are not really they're going unreported essentially, and are not quantified to the extent that greenhouse gas benefits are. And so I think this is an opportunity to really elevate that component of existing or new projects, and also increase the awareness of the cost of biodiversity conservation and restoration. If you can come up with a unit, might not be the perfect unit, but it is a unit of biodiversity benefits, and will help us, I think, highlight what it takes to actually conserve and restore nature, and what something like the Global Biodiversity Framework will truly take to actually meet the goals and targets that's set out in that.
Yeah, and we've been, I've been doing conservation for a long time. And when we started down this path, I recognized we don't have a shared agreement on what good conservation is. And this, the work that we've been doing on biodiversity credits and work everyone's been doing is helping us come up with that definition, quantified, documented, verified, that kind of thing. So, so it's exciting to see that movement. But again, there's so many standards right now and so many different approaches. It's going to be interesting watching that piece develop. Toral, maybe to you, and we talked a little bit about the demand, and Tim mentioned, disclosure and potential regulatory, and what has been your experience, and who's interested in the credits that you're trying to generate, and what's speaking to them in terms of how you communicate these?
Yeah, so I think it's worth saying that Plan Vivo, as a standard, we stay independent of any selling or buying of the credits. We're a certifier that makes sure a project is developed and designed in a way that meets our requirements with certain criteria. But with that said, what we're seeing and what we're trying to work with our projects to communicate is really all of what the project involves. So when it comes to sort of pricing the credits and then communicating that to the buyers, is really around communicating what it takes to do the work. So all of your operational costs, all of your reporting, monitoring costs, your certification costs, and then also being able to factor in the kind of uniqueness of the project. So what are the story behind the project? How do they go about, do they have any threatened or rare endangered species that they have extra requirements and interventions to incorporate? And then really looking at what about the market-based additional factors that influence the pricing. So that is kind of what we're focusing on, is trying to guide our emerging and developing projects around communicating to their prospective buyers what it means to really price a biodiversity credit and communicate the true cost of conservation, because it's really not just about getting a project off the ground, but it's really about having that holistic impact, which again means to their prospective buyers and to the demand side that you are investing and investing in projects that are of high quality, which is not only about risk mitigation, but it's also about opportunity. And you are having something that is not generating biodiversity benefits alone, but it's actually creating livelihood impacts. It's creating climate change impacts. So that's really what we're focused on. Is at this moment, we're really working with our projects to showcase to the demand, the emerging demand side, what a strong biodiversity credit or market looks like with high integrity projects that have strong community integration, and that will hopefully catalyze behavioral change that creates that long-term impact. And we hope that creates trust in a market that is emerging and still building on some of the lessons and pitfalls that we've learned from the voluntary carbon market. So that's kind of my response on what we're hearing from the demand side is, what does this mean? And that is what we're trying to showcase, what it means, what are biodiversity credits.
Yeah, great explanation. Thank you so much. Yeah, I find so much of what nature provides to us, there's no markets for. There's no way to monetize that value other than carbon, other than ecotourism, maybe some fisheries, things like that. But so this is an opportunity to say, hey, there's other values. Let's invest in this because we all depend on it so much. Grégoire, over to you. What do you think are some of the what are you finding some of the challenges of developing this market or moving the market forward or bringing more money in to the market, and how is IAPB seeking to address those?
Yeah, thank you, David. I think like we are an international initiative, but we are not alone, as you said before. So there are a lot of different initiatives. I think you mentioned Biodiversity Credits Alliance, of course. You mentioned also the World Economic Forum. There is also the Organization for Biodiversity Certificates, and so on. So I think the main idea as an international initiative was to not reinvent the wheel, was to not like bring new principles and just to bring new principles, and that's it. So what we try to do since now a few months is to work very closely with other organizations and to try to develop like kind of very high level principles to be able to develop the foundation, to lay the foundation of a potential market. So we work very closely with BCA and with WEF to develop these high-level principles. So of course we look at the different views of the market players. Yesterday we have seen the very interesting publication of Plan Vivo, of course, on these principles. And yeah, I think the idea is like to have like a common production and to show the convergence on many issues. So we spoke a little bit about additionality. We can speak about all the issues around third-party assurance, validation, verification, this kind of issue, measurement, metrics, and so on. So there are a lot of area where we need to try to develop the foundation for a market. So we have the ambition to develop at Cali those high level principles, and after maybe to develop more targeted guidelines for market players. So it could be on the measurement part, it could be also like recommendations, because of course we are an organization supported by 2 governments. So I think it's very important to be able to have like very clear recommendations for governments, but also for market players, buyers, project developers, to support the development of a high integrity market. So that's an ambition. It's of course not easy because there are still area of discussions, still very technical topics on, for example, marine ecosystem, on some place where things are very more complex and it's hard to have like a common view, but that's something we need to try collectively on in the next months.
Yeah, so many questions to address. So there have been some really great questions that have been coming in. Actually, there's quite a huge number of questions, and so I of course I could keep asking you all questions, but let's see if we can go to Sam and bring in some of these questions. And feel free to just kind of unmute yourself, panelists, and answer the questions as they come up, and we'll see how many we can go through. Sam, over to you.
All right. Hello, everyone. We have this great question in from Constance Wong, who addresses something that Grégoire just sort of brought up. What differences and challenges do you foresee in developing biodiversity or nature credits for marine ecosystems versus terrestrial ones?
Sorry, was that for a specific person, or I mean, I can
No,
talk.
Anyone, Toral, if
anyone
you
can
want to
answer.
take it, go for it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I was also just about to reply to a question in the Q&A, which was similar around, how is PV nature applicable globally? So first of all, it is applicable globally, but we are finding that with marine versus terrestrial, there are definitely some challenges. Marine by nature is more complex, as you can imagine. Measuring and monitoring things underwater proves way more challenging than on land. And so it requires a bit of innovation. One of the biggest challenges is that you can't apply the same tools and approaches to this different types of ecosystems in the marine sphere. For example, in a forest versus in a grassland on the terrestrial side, you may be able to monitor certain groups or organisms using similar approaches. And on top of that, you can use satellite imagery more reliably. Whereas when it comes to marine ecosystems, things like mangroves versus seagrass versus coral reefs or salt marshes, they all need to be looked at in an independent way, slightly different. They have various different variables and environmental conditions that impact their nature. And then, of course, when it comes to remote tools like remote sensing or satellite imagery, it can't be used in the same way either. So there needs to be a bit of an adaptation there on how we approach marine ecosystems and the types of tools and methods that we use to monitor. And really the way Plan Vivo is approaching this is by trying to work with a set number of projects in these varying ecosystems and helping us. So they're sort of leading the way on what's working and what's not working, where we're innovating, where we need to take some existing approaches and adapt them. So yeah, it's definitely challenging. There's a bit of time required on figuring that out. But I think there's a good opportunity here for biodiversity credits to put marine projects on the map, where some existing market-based mechanisms like the carbon market don't apply as naturally as biodiversity.
Great, thank you. We have another question, again, sort of on the topic of process integrating biodiversity credits into existing projects from Rajul Gurung from the Mount Everest Forest Botanicals Alliance in Nepal. Thank you for being with us today. So how can for anyone to answer on the panel, how can biodiversity credits be effectively integrated into existing or even work in progress conservation projects, particularly in the global South or globally? And anyone can answer that.
Yeah, I can kick it off, and Toral, feel free to add on. But I would say to start looking at the different standards that are out there. Obviously, Verra and Plan Vivo are represented here. There are others that may or may not be more applicable to your specific project context. So it's important to try to understand what may be best use for your particular project. But I would say, make sure, if you haven't already, start collecting the sort of baseline data that you'll need. What is the current state of nature and biodiversity in that area? That is the key to getting started. So if you haven't done that yet, definitely start doing that, and then looking into these programs to understand what the requirements are for indicator selection and monitoring, to kind of move forward from there. And I'm sure at least both the programs represented here have ways to integrate their various programs together. I know for Verra, we will have a streamlined approach to pursue multiple programs at one time. So I'd also look into kind of that joint development process as well.
I'd like to maybe bring up a question there and pose it to Tim. In a way, this touches on additionality to a certain extent. In other words, say you have an ongoing project that is doing good conservation. And again, this comes up, with protected areas and with others, and this is why we're working on that stewardship certificate idea. But how do you deal with additionality? Like, we're already doing well, but we don't necessarily have enough money to continue. We don't have sustainable finance. but we've managed to get by. Any thoughts? I'm shouting out to you, Tim, but it could be anyone else that may have a thought
Yeah,
on this.
I mean, if I'm in the middle of making a cake, and I'm missing eggs, it's really a question, I'm really skeptical that I should try to turn that into a souffle or a seafood dinner, right? And I'd say the same thing on projects. This is a new market with very little to almost zero funding right now. And unless you're at the very beginning of a project, I would just keep going with that project with one of 40 other streams of funding and structure that you could pursue. And if you're interested in biodiversity credits, really think about it as a biodiversity credit project first, because it's complicated. So much is new, and everything that Sinclair said, and also Toral, your remarks from earlier, there's a lot of kind of recipes to look at to figure out how to design the project to make it most likely that you have biodiversity credits that somebody would want. And that's different than if you're trying to get set up for a debt for nature swap or an easement or a government international development institution grant. So that would be my advice is, start with something where you're really building a biodiversity credit cake from the first instance.
Great.
I would just add a comment there, kind of building on the cake analogy. I think if your vision is to build a cake, then that is what you should go for. And it really comes down to having a theory of change over your project period, or what is it you're trying to, what is the logic? What are you trying to achieve? And that should be built into how you design that project. So you may need more than one finance stream. But it really should be something that you're thinking about for that site and the vision for that site from the beginning.
Great. Yeah, it is quite complex to try to get a third-party verified, this. So maybe one more question, and then I'm going to ask all the panelists to kind of give a maybe summary statement. So over to you, Sam.
Okay, we'll try to do a few at once. We're getting a lot of questions about demand. So what is your experience? What are the challenges and opportunities right now with the voluntary market for this and the demand for these credits? Yeah, for biodiversity nature credits in the past versus now, what are your experiences like?
Well, while everyone thinks, let me just share, this is a very early market, but so, when we think about it, we ask, well, who is, the natural buyer for these, right? And so what we've come up with, it, especially if you can't use them as a direct offset. In other words, and there's a lot of resistance to using them as an offset, because if I destroy nature here, well, I can just buy credits here. That feels wrong to a lot of people, okay? So regulatory markets could be the solution there. But for voluntary markets, it seems that there's an opportunity for companies who have supply chains at risk due to biodiversity loss to invest in those supply chains. And it's hard to do that directly. You don't know necessarily your suppliers, you have outgrowers. So there's an opportunity. And interestingly, even individual companies may have supply chains that are very limited, but the banks that are financing them have more systemic risk. And the insurance companies, especially the reinsurers, have systemic risk and are aware of the systemic risk and could be really great buyers or demand for these credits. Anyone else want to add a thought on that? Grégoire.
Yeah, thank you, David. No, I'm kind of agree with you. Of course, I think the demand is kind of the elephant in the room since a long time. We need to think how to combine a nature strategy and biodiversity credits in the future. So that's why we need to work on clear guidance on claims, then maybe later on some market infrastructure, on some tradability later. Clearly, at this stage, we are not at this stage of development of market readiness. So that's not something we should consider at this stage. There is like huge work done by some organization like TNFD, SBTN, but we still have a lot to do. For example, like we know in SBTN biodiversity credits, they could play a role at some point, but actually it's not the case at this stage. So we need to work on that and do like step by step to first develop the market readiness, and after we will see like the role of biodiversity credit and in all the strategies.
Yes, excellent. All right, well, I think we have time for everyone to basically take a minute and maybe sum up their thoughts from this discussion, or just from where they think we're heading on biodiversity credits. And we'll go in order of from how we started. Tim, over to you.
Yeah, thank you all for joining the webinar today. The kind of fundamental bet that I make is that while we can decarbonize our global economy, we cannot de-extinctionize our global economy. That food production will always harm nature, that adding 4 billion people to the middle class will always harm nature. And so the need for a unit with which to transact around that impact is perpetual. I just think it's perpetual. And the rarer nature gets, the more valuable it gets. So even if this market doesn't grow, demand doesn't grow as fast as you think it will or you hope it will, it is going to grow. That's the fundamental bet that I make. And in the context of that bet, the best first biodiversity credit projects are ones that ecologists slam dunk know they can create uplift for nature. They've been done before, they've been done repeatedly. Those projects will make the best units for transacting with whichever buyers show up first. And I just think that's going to be a perpetual need that we have. And I don't think humans are going to become any less enamored of nature as that progression continues. That's the bet of why biodiversity credits are so valuable. Not that it's excitement and euphoria right now. It's that it's a long-term opportunity. Thanks.
Great. Sinclair.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely agree. And maybe picking up on what Tim just said, it's essential. I would say the one barrier we will have to succeeding is criticism without solutions being suggested. And so if we aren't able to collectively try to sort through some of the problems, accept some of them might go unresolved for a little while we test, then we'll never be able to kind of scale in any way. And so we need to keep it simple, but we also need to allow companies to take risk and enter this space and pay the price that it takes to implement this essential conservation and restoration that's so needed and never going to go away. And so if we constantly kind of beat them over the head of not doing it right, then we'll never have any finance flowing. So criticism is fine as long as some workable solutions are also proposed at the same time.
Great. Yeah. Learning by doing. Grégoire, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, David. No, we mentioned a lot of time during this webinar, but I think biodiversity credit is clearly not the silver bullet. We know that. We know the voluntary market will be very, of course, important to it, but beyond the voluntary market, we need to put pressure on government, on all the other potential instruments, and about the good articulation of biodiversity credit and of course the offset and all other subsidies and all the policies to have like correct global policy to support and finance biodiversity.
Great. Yeah, I do think governments have a huge role here going forward. And Toral, over to you.
Yeah, thanks again for the invitation and for joining. I think for me, it's just all about opportunity. From the demand side, I see, we all have dependencies. Every single one of us has dependencies on nature, and we have the opportunity to build resilience against those dependencies within, whether it's individuals or from supply or value chains. We have the opportunity to improve our reputation, get ahead of regulation. But from the project side, we have an opportunity to really showcase and put ecosystems biodiversity on the map and integrate community-led monitoring. I really think that there's a huge opportunity here. And I think it really gives the private sector a chance to kind of step up and begin contributing to this movement towards restoring and protecting nature so that we can see long-term change. Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you. Well, I want to thank all the panelists for sharing your knowledge and experience with us. It was a really great panel, and thank you all for participating, all for joining and listening, and all the great questions. And we look forward to continuing the conversation. So everyone have a great rest of your day, evening, morning, and we look forward to speaking again. Thanks again.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Thank you all.